On which issue? The force of the probable cause? On the probable cause. I'm only arguing it on the probable cause. Yes, I believe that by watching the video, any reasonable officer who came into contact with Mr. Scott would perceive that he was definitely in a crisis situation, that he definitely was seeking help. In fact, he asked for the help. And that's why this case is so tragic, is they were trying to accomplish the goal that he asked them to be there for. When he says, put me in the car, when he asks them, when he hands the knife to them and they take it, it is clearly any reasonable officer would be, we've got to find out what's wrong with this person. And if they had just left him to his own device, and even plaintiff's experts said that, the mistake they made was that they should have waited for more officers to take him to the ground. They should have, he never said they shouldn't have taken him into custody. He never said that they should not have attempted to get him this mental help that he needed. And so I do believe that the video blatantly contradicts, and just the evidence in general, the phone call itself, where someone calls and says, hey, I want the police here because people are trying to kill me. And, the officers were young and they handled it very well. And they went, they talked to him, they tried to find out what he needed. They called their sergeant. They sought the type of supervision that you'd like to be guiding such officers. And so any reasonable officer, because the police are now, as you're all very aware, they're being tasked with these mental health issues, which are not criminal in nature and fall under the community caretaking function. And the courts are asking these officers to make sure they receive the mental health training they need so that they can provide that to these people. And based upon the evidence in the video, it's clear that there was a slight probability, or a fair probability is the better way to put it, as the Supreme Court has defined probable cause, a fair probability that he required at least a detention for further investigation as to what he was going through and what help he actually needed. And I don't think there's any evidence that they are plainly incompetent or knowingly violated the law, which the plaintiff would need to show to defeat their qualified immunity argument. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you, counsel.
Okay.
All right, we'll put 3 minutes back on the clock for your rebuttal.
Thank you.
Good morning, Your Honors. If it please the court, my name is Peter Goldstein. I represent the appellee. It's clear that we do have a mental health crisis in this country. There are numerous instances of persons that are suffering from a mental disorder or a mental crisis that are being shot and killed or killed in some manner by the police. But in this case, if I can just go through the chronology for a moment, and I want to point out that Mr. Scott, when he was being handcuffed and taken to the ground, said please 63 times, begging the officers to not stay on top of him, not to use force on him. But starting in the beginning, the officers, Smith and Huntsman, they were young officers. They didn't know exactly what to do in this situation. They were both crisis intervention trained, which means that they had the 40 hours of mental health training that Metro provides. However, they had no knowledge of what to do in this case, so they called their sergeant. And their sergeant said, after they told him he's not coming to the door, leave. Just go ahead and leave. It's not a big deal. Go about your other assignments. But they didn't. They started shining the flashlight inside of his window, which of course is going to exacerbate any crisis or paranoia that Mr. Scott was suffering. And eventually he came out. He came down the stairs, and the officers initially pulled their gun on him. And Mr. Scott dropped a pipe that he was carrying. And later on, he handed one of the officers a kitchen knife, and he handed it holding the blade, giving the handle to the officer. He begged them not to search him in a manner that requires him to face the wall because of his paranoia. He was begging them to understand his situation. So the district court, in a very well-reasoned, very articulate order, went through all the facts. And we've got to the point now where appellants believe that they can file interlocutory appeals on all these disputed issues of fact, which is not the whole purpose of the interlocutory appeal on the limited issue of qualified immunity. But I think they're forcing lawyers to take every case only if it matches a specific other case right on point. Otherwise, you're going to lose because we're going to appeal it to qualified immunity. I mean, this is burdensome for the plaintiffs to have to go through 5 years of litigation and when the Ninth Circuit issued a sua sponte order requesting a briefing on why this should be before us on the issue of interlocutory appeal and qualified immunity, because there's a question of fact. And unfortunately, the district court did not rule in our favor on the motion to dismiss the appeal. So here we are relitigating the whole case over and over again. But getting back to the facts again. So the district court, Judge Boulware, in a very articulate opinion, argued and wrote an opinion that stated that this incident, this person did not meet the criteria for a legal 2000, which is the same as a California 5150. Is the person suffering from a mental health crisis to the point where he is a danger to himself or others and needs to be evaluated for treatment? So they say we didn't plead false arrest. Well, that is technically not an arrest. When you take somebody in for legal 2000 for an evaluation, that's not deemed to be an arrest. So we didn't have the burden of pleading that. We didn't have to. In any event, the officers really did not know what to do. So Mr. Anderson argues that they were doing an investigation. Well, getting back to the point where after they handcuffed him, and he's been on the ground for a while, he was prone for about 1 minute and 42 seconds with weight on his back and chest and shoulders, because both officers simultaneously placing weight on him.
Let me ask you a question about
Sure.
Drummond. Is the rule in Drummond limited only to cases where an individual is handcuffed?
No, Your Honor, I've never seen that distinction. In fact, actually, if somebody's not handcuffed, there's evidence that the physiological distress can be more severe because they're more apt to struggle. But Drummond did not state that. Drummond did not state that at all. Weight on the back, whether or not the person is handcuffed or his arms are to the side, doesn't make any physiological difference. I mean, if his arms are to the side, he's almost trying to do a push-up. That doesn't matter. That they call that segmenting, which is no longer used in the training, because you don't want to continue to place somebody in a position where you can impair their breathing. And this is what happened in this case. He died of cardiac failure from hypoxia. He could not breathe. He could not get air. So after they get him handcuffed, they put him on his side. They ignored him completely. I mean, there was no investigation. They're not asking him questions. And by the way, back to Mr. Anderson's point about he was a threat or he was a danger. They testified in deposition he was not a danger to anybody. He certainly did not commit any crime. He didn't appear to be a danger to himself. And there was no basis to take him in because the court noted that at the time of March 3, 2019, the Legal 2000 statute specifically required that this be the result of a mental illness, and that criteria was not.
But even if there is a disputed fact about this, don't we have to resolve that in favor of the plaintiff?
I believe you do. We do, yes. Yeah, that's exactly what I believe is why we shouldn't be here today, because this court should not have jurisdiction over disputed issues of fact. I mean, the trial court, the district court determined what the facts were in a 32-page order, went through it line by line, what happened, and determined that all the claims survive except for the denial of medical care, which we withdrew. The other claim, as far as the ADA violation, was only against Metro, not against the individual officers. Other than that, all of our claims survived. The excessive force, the Fourth Amendment violation, the 14th Amendment violation. So, and speaking of the Monell claim, because that was brought up, Officer Huntsman testified in deposition that he had never been trained that placing weight on a suspect in a prone position can cause a danger of impaired breathing that could likely result in hypoxia. He said, no, I've never received that training. And ironically, this is what is so stunning in my opinion, the video in this case is actually used by Metro as a training video of what to do in the event you're trying to take a suspect into custody in a situation like this. They actually use this video, not the end where you see Mr. Scott pass away, but in the initial handcuffing, they use it as a training video. So that's ratification. They're basically saying, this is the way you do it, even though the end result was Mr. Scott died. And we see that. And by the way, Mr. Officer Smith testified in deposition and in his statement that he did a sternum rub 20 times. Now, a sternum rub is where you take your knuckle basically and rub it against the person's chest to see if there's any reaction. It's a pain technique, so there's going to be some kind of reaction by the person. He did it once in the video and he went like this. He barely touched Mr. Scott. So they just basically left him to die. Now, we know that that claim was withdrawn in terms of the failure to provide medical care after they handcuffed him, but that, to me, it's a sham investigation. They didn't really investigate the officer's conduct in this case, and they did not have probable cause under the statute to take Mr. Scott into custody for an evaluation.